Watch the timing on this one, because timing is the whole story. Donald Trump didn't wake up one morning and suddenly remember Russia exists. He stood in Evian, France, beside the leaders of the G7 and announced that the sanctions relief Moscow had been quietly enjoying for months is about to disappear. All because, in his words, the oil is now flowing through the Strait of Hormuz again. Think about that sentence for a second. The fate of the Russian economy, the leverage in a war that has killed and displaced millions, the entire direction of Eastern European geopolitics just got tied to a shipping lane 8,000 miles away in the Persian Gulf. That is not a coincidence. That is a mechanism. And once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. What looks like a moral stand against Vladimir Putin is, when you trace the wiring back to its source, a pressure valve being adjusted on a global energy system that has nothing to do with morality at all. Stay with me here, because by the end of this, you are going to understand why the timing of this announcement tells you more about the next 6 months of world history than anything Trump actually said out loud. Let's start with the official story, because you need to understand it before I show you what's underneath it. For the last several months, the administration had been easing sanctions on Russian oil, not tightening them. That's the part most people missed, because it doesn't fit the narrative either side wants you to believe. Back in March, when the bombs over Iran sent crude prices into a spike that every American driver felt at the pump, the White House quietly issued licenses that loosened the restrictions on Russian oil purchases. Senators were furious about it. Democrats put out statements accusing the administration of bailing out Moscow's war machine to manage the political fallout of an unrelated war, and for a while it actually worked. Prices cooled, and the conversation moved on. Then in May, the waiver got terminated, then extended again a single day later, then extended once more. If your head is spinning trying to follow the back and forth, good, because that confusion is not a bug, it's the entire point. A system that flips its position every 30 days isn't failing to find clarity. It's telling you very loudly that clarity was never the goal, flexibility was. Now here's the question I want you to actually sit with, because I think it's more important than anything a pundit on cable news will ask you tonight. If sanctions on Russian oil are supposed to be a moral lever, a punishment for an unprovoked war that has flattened cities and stolen children, why are they treated like a thermostat? You don't turn morality up and down based on what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. You either believe funding a war machine is wrong or you don't. But what we are watching in real time is something else entirely. We are watching energy policy wearing the costume of foreign policy. And once you start looking at world events through that lens, through the lens of the chessboard rather than the headline, an enormous number of things that seem confusing suddenly snap into focus. Here's the critical realization I want to plant right now, and I promise you I'm going to unpack this fully before we're done. The Russia sanctions conversation, the Iran ceasefire, the Strait of Hormuz, and even Ukraine's sudden sprint toward European Union membership are not 4 separate news stories. They are 4 faces of the same die, and the hand rolling that die is not sitting in Moscow or in Kiev. It's sitting somewhere closer to home than most people are comfortable admitting. Keep that thought in your back pocket, because we are going to walk through each piece. And when we get to the final third of this video, it's going to click into place in a way that I think will genuinely change how you watch the next round of headlines. So let's go back to the chessboard for a moment, because that's really the only honest way to describe what's happening here. On one side of the board, you have Russia grinding through a war that has now run for more than 4 years, a war Trump himself promised during the campaign he could end in 24 hours. He has since admitted, in his own words, that it's been much harder than he thought. That admission matters more than people give it credit for. It's not weakness, it's a tell. It tells you that the easy version of this conflict, the version where American leverage simply forces a deal, never existed. Putin has shown, summit after summit, call after call, that he can sit across the table from Trump, have what Trump himself calls a good conversation, and then simply continue doing exactly what he was doing before. Hours before the G7 summit even began, Russia launched one of its largest barrages of the war on Ukraine's biggest cities, killing 11 people and setting fire to a religious landmark. This after Zelensky and Putin had each separately spoken with Trump by phone just a day earlier on Trump's own birthday. Read that timeline again. A phone call promising progress followed within hours by a wave of missiles. That is not the behavior of a man worried about sanctions. That is the behavior of a man who has done the math and concluded that the cost of continuing is still lower than the cost of stopping. And that brings us to the marketing ploy, because that's really what I think this sanctions threat is, at least in its current form. Trump didn't announce new sanctions in Evian. He announced the possibility of restoring sanctions that had already existed and had already been loosened. That's a crucial distinction. It lets him appear tough to a G7 room that is increasingly frustrated with America's inconsistency. It lets him appear tough to a domestic audience that has watched oil money keep flowing into the Kremlin's war chest, and it costs him absolutely nothing in the moment because the actual policy hasn't changed yet, it's only been signaled. Geopolitics runs on signals like this constantly. A signal is cheap, a signal lets you shape perception today, while leaving yourself every option to reverse course tomorrow, the exact same way the March to May whiplash on these very sanctions proved the administration is willing to do. I want you to ask yourself something here, and I'd genuinely love to hear your answer in the comments. When a government changes its position on the same sanction 4 times in 3 months, are we watching strategy, or are we watching an administration that is simply reacting to oil prices one news cycle at a time? Because here's what almost nobody is saying out loud. The price of crude oil touches everything in the American economy, every grocery delivery truck, every plane ticket, every plastic product on every shelf. A president doesn't get to be tough on Russia and gentle on gas prices simultaneously, not when Russia is one of the 3 or 4 largest oil producers on the planet. So when Trump says almost casually that sanctions can go back in place soon because oil is flowing again through the Strait of Hormuz, what he is actually telling you is that the Russia sanctions were never really about Russia. They were a dial connected to the same machine that controls what you pay at the pump. Tighten Iran's flow, loosen Russia's. Open up Hormuz again, tighten Russia's. It is one single global oil equation, and Ukraine, tragically, is just one of the variables being solved for. But to understand why this matters beyond the price of gasoline, we have to look at what else happened at that same summit, because this is where the story stops being about oil and starts being about something much bigger, something closer to the architecture of the post-war world itself. While Trump was talking about sanctions, Ukraine officially began its European Union membership negotiations. Think about what that actually means. This is a nation under active bombardment, a nation that just absorbed one of the largest missile barrages of the entire war only hours earlier, formally starting the bureaucratic multi-year process of binding itself permanently to Brussels. Zelensky has been explicit about why NATO membership, the security guarantee that would have meant an actual American and European commitment to defend Ukrainian soil, is being blocked, and not by Moscow. It's being blocked by Washington. The Trump administration has made clear that NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table, so the European Union, an economic and political bloc rather than a military alliance, becomes the consolation prize, the substitute guarantee in a world where the strongest guarantee has been quietly taken off the menu. Now here is where I think the deeper truth starts to surface, and this is the realization I asked you to hold on to earlier. What we are watching is not really a story about whether Russia gets punished enough or whether Ukraine gets protected enough. What we are watching is the United States slowly, methodically, transferring the financial and military burden of this war onto Europe, while keeping just enough rhetorical leverage, just enough sanctions talk, just enough summit photo opportunities to remain the central character in the story. France and its allies are now the largest providers of military and financial support to Kyiv, a sentence that would have seemed almost unthinkable 5 years ago, when American aid dwarfed every European contribution combined. Britain is rolling out its own sanctions on the so-called shadow fleet, the tankers Russia uses to dodge the existing price cap, essentially doing the enforcement work that Washington has been inconsistent about doing itself. France is offering to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Patriot missile production is being expanded through European licensing deals rather than direct American shipments. Do you see the pattern forming here? America is positioning itself as the deal maker, the man at the center of the table, the one whose phone calls matter most, while quietly stepping back from being the primary financier and guarantor. That is not isolationism in the traditional sense. It's something more sophisticated. It's outsourcing the cost while retaining the credit. And this is where the moral dimension of this story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because I don't think there's an easy villain here, and I'm not interested in giving you one just to make this video feel satisfying. There's a real argument that America has carried too much of the financial weight of global security for too many decades, and that allies stepping up is not a betrayal but a long overdue correction. There's also a real argument that flipping sanctions on and off, like a light switch based on domestic gas prices, sends Vladimir Putin the exact signal he needs to keep grinding forward, because he has learned, through 4 years of pattern recognition, that American resolve has a price, and that price moves with the cost of a barrel of crude. I genuinely want to know where you land on this, because I think the honest answer is more complicated than either side of the cable news debate wants to admit. Is the United States right to make its allies shoulder more of this burden, even if it means the war drags on longer because the pressure on Moscow becomes less coordinated? That's not a rhetorical question. I want to read what you actually think in the comments, because this audience tends to see through the noise faster than most. Let's talk about Putin for a moment, because his behavior throughout all of this has been remarkably, almost eerily consistent, and consistency is information. Every single time a summit gets scheduled, hope rises. The Alaska meeting back in August, the Budapest summit that got shelved indefinitely after Trump grew frustrated that talking to Putin, in his own description, simply doesn't go anywhere. And each time, in the immediate aftermath of renewed diplomatic contact, Russia escalates rather than de-escalates. That is not erratic behavior. That is a strategy, and a fairly transparent one, once you stop expecting good faith and start simply observing the pattern. Putin understands that every day the war continues. Western unity frays a little further, sanctions enforcement becomes a little more inconsistent, and the economic and political cost to Russia of simply waiting out the West continues to look more attractive than the alternative of a negotiated peace that locks in territorial losses. He is not playing checkers against a confused opponent. He is playing a long game against an opponent whose attention span, by design or by necessity, keeps getting pulled toward the next crisis, whether that's Iran, whether that's domestic inflation, whether that's the next election cycle. Which brings me to the piece of this puzzle that I think deserves far more attention than it's getting, and this is the part I promised you earlier we would fully unpack. The real story here isn't Russia versus Ukraine, and it isn't even America versus Russia. The real story is the slow, deliberate construction of a multipolar energy and security order, where no single nation, not even the United States, gets to dictate terms unilaterally anymore. Look at the guest list at that G7 summit. Brazil, India, Kenya, South Korea, these are not G7 members. They were invited specifically into discussions that touch on Russian oil, on the Strait of Hormuz, on global energy security. Why? Because India alone is the largest buyer of seaborne Russian crude on the planet. When sanctions tightened on Rosneft and Lukoil back in October, Indian refiners were reported to be sharply cutting their imports, and Chinese state oil majors reportedly suspended purchases in the short term as well. That sent global oil prices up roughly 5% in a matter of days. You cannot sanction Russian oil without immediately and directly affecting the economic calculus of India and China, two nations that are not exactly eager to take orders from Washington on how to run their own energy security. So when Trump talks about reimposing sanctions, he isn't just threatening Moscow. He's testing the willingness of New Delhi and Beijing to go along with it. And that test, far more than anything happening between Russia and Ukraine, is the real measure of whether the old American-led order still has teeth, or whether we are watching it get quietly replaced by something more fragmented, more transactional, and frankly more honest about whose interests actually drive global decisions. This is the deep current running underneath every headline about sanctions, every G7 statement, every diplomatic phone call. The question is no longer simply whether Russia wins or loses in Ukraine. The question is whether the United States can still unilaterally set the rules of the global energy game, or whether we have already crossed into an era where Washington has to negotiate, cajole, and incentivize the rest of the world into compliance, the same way it now has to lean on France and Britain to carry military weight it once carried alone. Every flip-flop on these sanctions, every 30-day extension, every sudden reversal is a small data point in that much larger story. It's the sound of an empire that built the rules now discovering it has to ask permission to enforce them. I'll leave you with this thought because I think it's the one that matters most. For decades, the story Americans were told about sanctions was simple. They are a moral instrument, a punishment for bad behavior on the world stage, clean and unambiguous. What we are watching now, in real time, in this back and forth over Russian oil, is the unmasking of that story. Sanctions are not a moral lever. They are an economic lever, wearing moral language, deployed and withdrawn based on domestic gas prices, alliance politics, and the willingness of countries like India and China to play along. None of that makes Russia's war any less brutal, and none of it makes Ukraine's suffering any less real. But it should change how you listen the next time a politician, any politician, frames a sanctions announcement as a simple matter of right and wrong. Behind every one of those announcements is a far more complicated negotiation, happening in rooms you and I will never see, between interests that rarely announce themselves honestly. So here's my real question for you, the one I want this whole comment section built around tonight. If sanctions have become this flexible, this transactional, this tied to the price of oil rather than the principle they claim to defend, do they still mean anything at all? Or have we simply been watching a very expensive piece of theater this entire time? Tell me where you stand, because I read every single one of these, and this conversation only gets sharper when you bring your own eyes to it.